Magic's the grandfather of TCGs, and for more than 3 decades, they showcase some of the best design, art, and in-world storytelling of any game. They had the best competitive play with the standard format, which received very few bans over the course of its history when you compared to other TCGs. And Magic would reinvent itself each year with a brand new plane for players to explore through their 3-set block system. But Magic has quickly become a very different game. In my last episode, I investigated how Magic's card design has changed and how it's put more of an emphasis on positive, parallel play patterns that result in kind of a one-dimensional game. But today we're going to zoom out even more and look at Magic's overall product design. They've ditched blocks entirely. Standard is kind of running on fumes at this point, and Universes Beyond has nearly replaced Magic's own creative, original world building with outside intellectual property. It turns out that these changes can be traced back to a couple of articles head designer Mark Rosewater wrote in 2014 and 2017 called Metamorphosis and Metamorphosis 2.0. In the first Metamorphosis article, Mark Rosewater lays out the problems that Magic was facing at the time and their proposed solutions going forward, and it really was a reinvention of the game in 2014. In 2017, Mark comes back to discuss how those changes sort of panned out. Not great. So let's dig into the problems that Magic was facing at the time, how those solutions came to be, and how they shaped Magic to be the game that it is today. And hopefully we can see if Magic the Gathering is in a good position to survive when this current TCG bubble inevitably pops. And I have some concerns. So let's get into it.
Distraction makers.
In the first Metamorphosis article in 2014, Mark lays out the sort of 4 fundamental problems that Magic was facing at the time. The first one is that the third set and the 3-set block structure was performing relatively poorly compared to the other 2 sets in the block. And so they would have an influx of new players in the fall when the initial set would come out, and then it would kind of taper off a little bit so that the second set was good but not great. And then the third set almost always performed pretty poorly. And they called this the third set problem. The second problem that they were having is that they were actually releasing 4 sets a year, and one of those 4 sets was what is called a core set. And a core set is basically a reprint set that's also made as an onboarding point for new players. So the block itself would have sort of lesser complexity than the other sets, and also a lot of reprints to revitalize, to bring back some important game pieces that players theoretically might already own and kind of bring some exciting things back to the format. It gave them an opportunity to give specific tools to a meta to try to even things out a bit. And the problem that they were having with core sets is that they had kind of an identity crisis. Was this a set for competitive players to introduce new format staples to the metagame? Or was this a format for new players that should have relatively low complexity as a good onboarding point for them? And so the core sets, they sort of were this weird in-between where competitive players saw them as entry beginner sets, and beginner players saw them as sets that were just reprints for competitive players. And this was their diagnosis for why they were thinking the core sets were not selling as well as main sets. The third problem that they were having is that the standard metagame had begun to be solved too quickly. And this is due to a combination of factors. We've talked in a previous video about the concept of Escher's stairwell, which is how Magic tried to keep the standard format at a relatively similar power level over time by placing the power of a set in particular areas so that certain parts of the game could be powerful, while other parts of that set might be less, and then another set, different parts could be more powerful. And so the sets would fit together like puzzle pieces to make sure that nothing was too far out of line power level wise in the format. And this Escher's stairwell worked really well for what I would consider the golden age of standard, which is somewhere between 2003, 2006 to around 2016 or so. And part of the problem with the metagame being solved is that there's just access to so much more information. And this is a problem that lots of competitive games have been trying to wrestle with and figure out how to keep their metagames from being solved. This is something we talk about on the channel a lot, usually referred to as a system of entropy, which basically means that you need some kind of system in place to keep it so that players can't always play the most optimal strategy. And deck builders are a pretty good example of this, or draft formats where you just might not have access to all the game pieces. So the final problem that they were having was a storytelling problem. And this one's kind of weird, right? Because to me, the 3-set block structure was very good at telling a story about a particular plane, right? But Magic found itself in this position where they didn't have recurring characters that they could use for marketing purposes. These would be the Planeswalkers, would be the characters that would be invented to try to solve this problem. And they would quickly try to make them become the face of Magic the Gathering. Jace, Liliana, Chandra, those Planeswalkers. In 2014, the Planeswalkers were already around, but the problem they were having is that they were unable to move the sort of Planeswalker story forward quickly enough when they were limited to just a 3-set block each year. And so that sort of leads us to our solutions. What they proposed to solve the third set issue, right, the fact that the third set wasn't selling very well, is that they were going to switch to 2-set blocks, right, where they would do 2 distinct different planes each year. I think the initial plan was that they would do 1 new plane still. That would be 1 large set and 1 small set. And then they would do a return to another plane that would be a large set and a small set. And part of this was to alleviate some of the workload from the creative team that it would be fairly impossible for them to be able to design 2 distinct worlds every year because the ramp up to 1 is pretty substantial. Theoretically, this would solve also the storytelling problem for them in that they could have more movement throughout their sort of multiverse so that the Planeswalker sort of overarching story could move forward faster. The way that they decided to solve the core set problem with it not having its own sort of distinct identity was to just get rid of it. When they were looking at like their capacity to build out sets, they were basically at a point where they could do 4 sets a year fairly comfortably, and they had been for 18 years up to this point. And so instead of trying to do 5 sets a year, they opted to remove the core set and instead roll those reprints into the other sets that would be the 2 distinct blocks with 2 sets each. And then finally, the standard metagame problem, they decided that instead of a set staying in standard for 2 years, they decided that a set would stay in standard for 18 months. And this lined up with their new sort of 2-set schedule, or 2-set block schedule, and that whenever a new set would come out, another one would rotate, and that would sort of keep things at this steady clip of rotation, which would hopefully turn the meta over more often, and players, as the meta was getting solved faster, this would leave less time for a solved meta to exist before something would rotate out. It's pretty important to understand how massive these changes were. The 3-set block structure had been in place for about 18 years up to this point. And at the time of the article, Mark says, it's important that we have a structure that players can follow. Having the Magic year always start with a large fall expansion set in a new world, for example, creates a rhythm that allows expectation and excitement. If we wanted to change our paradigm, it was important that we created a new structure that could likewise be anticipated by our audience. This meant that however we did it, each year would have to follow the same pattern. And I think this is not just important for player expectations, it's important for Wizards of the Coast shifting their internal design teams to make sure that they could accommodate this new schedule. Let's take an optimistic view about these changes before we go into sort of the what ultimately happened. Because I think on paper, these changes solve a lot of the problems that Magic was having. Ideally, they could go from the 3-set block model, which had a fantastic first set, an okay second set, and a pretty bad third set, to a new model that would basically get you 2 large sets a year. So you could have a great set, an okay set, and then another great set, and then another okay set, which would hopefully solve the third set issue. And the core set's primary function could just be rolled into those set releases, and then you don't need to do a core set at all. And with the standard metagame rotating more often, it would keep things fresh for the competitive players who might welcome a faster rotation if things were getting solved too quickly. So like I said, on paper, looks pretty good, but unfortunately, things wouldn't really pan out and instead would reveal that the diagnosis of a lot of these problems just wasn't quite accurate. And to Mark's credit, he does come clean and writes an article in 2017, Metamorphosis 2, that discusses sort of the fallout that came from these sort of massive fundamental changes of the game. Okay, so here's part 2. We have Metamorphosis 2.0. This is the after the changes that were proposed were executed, and this is kind of the fallout from those changes. This article comes out in 2017. And Mark starts off with the discussing the third set problem. And it turned out that it wasn't actually a third set problem. It was a small set problem, which means that they switched to 2 blocks, 2 sets each. And the first set did really well. But then the second set didn't do very well. It sort of became like the third set. It was something that players felt kind of like they could skip because the next set coming out was going to be a whole new thing to explore. Because of this increased pace, they were able to solve sort of that storytelling problem they were having with the Planeswalkers, but it turned out that players got tired of hearing about the same characters in rapid succession, right? The focus of what used to be on sort of these worlds became about just these characters, and it kind of flattened out the experience, right? You're just focused on these iconic sort of superhero-esque characters, which I think doesn't work as well in a card game where you, the player, are effectively supposed to be the protagonist. Even more problems began to reveal themselves with the idea that they were going to roll the core set into these other sets. And the big problem that they ran into was that core sets were kind of flavor agnostic. They're sort of set in Dominaria, which is Magic's main plane of existence. And so it's a bit of a blank canvas in terms of what types of cards that you can put in there. So the problem they would run into is that cards that needed a reprint and were the correct solution for the standard format, something like Inquisition of Kozilek, they were so flavor focused on Eldrazi that it didn't make any sense if Eldrazi weren't in the set that they were trying to put that reprint into. This would work fine for cards that are sort of flavor agnostic, something like Duress, but when you get into the more specifically named cards, it was difficult to put those into to fit those reprints into sets that were heavily themed that didn't line up with the way that the card was themed. And finally, we come to the standard problem of the metagame being solved too quickly, so they decided to speed up rotation. And this was met just with an extreme backlash and backfired almost immediately and was rolled back very quickly. I think that players were already sort of on the fence about the 2-year rotation that was happening before, and so increasing the pace on it made people feel like their cards would just become worthless too quickly. Okay, so let's get into part 3. And part 3 is that the third entry in the Metamorphosis articles, Metamorphosis 3, has never been written. So we're left to speculate, based on the state of Magic today, what Wizards of the Coast has decided to sort of do in response to the fact that the changes that they laid out in Metamorphosis 2 may or may not have panned out. It seems like with the idea of the two set block structure doesn't really seem to have panned out, and that the lesson that they took away was that small sets seem to not work as well. But there's a different way to look at this, right? It's that 3-set blocks may have done a better job selling smaller sets. The third set in the block may not have sold well, but the second set seemed like it was doing pretty well, and it was a smaller set. It allowed them to sort of reuse a plane of existence that they had made. It allowed them to create smaller sets and give designers more room to breathe and iterate on the mechanics and ideas that they had developed in the first set for this plane. And for my creative process, I've found that having a very particular time to devote to experimentation versus execution, you end up giving yourself room to breathe and experiment instead of just falling into a pattern of doing the sort of same repetitive thing over and over again. And I think we kind of see Magic falling into this pattern. A lot of the newer sets that they have made, not all of them, I think Bloomburrow is a pretty good example of a fresh new take and world in Magic, as well as new mechanics. But it does seem like Magic, because of the sort of breakneck pace that they're making stuff now, they don't really have the time to devote to experimentation. When we had 3-set blocks, it also felt like the game was more cohesive, right? It felt like things belonged together, where now it just sort of feels like a collection of stuff, a collection of worlds, a collection of characters, but less like there's a clear through line about why these things fit together the way that they do, where a 3-set block really honed in on a particular world and fleshed it out and made it feel complete. The sort of second problem here with core sets, it does seem like, Foundations has done an okay job fixing some of those problems and that they needed to bring back those reprints, developed a set that theoretically they don't have to design every year. However, that does lead to kind of a more static meta, and they don't have a sort of flavor agnostic place to put these reprints that might be required to improve the metagame. And so instead, they're relying upon Foundations to kind of do that work. We've kind of already seen some cracks with this. If there's a particularly kind of powerful staple card in Foundations, and then an additional one gets printed in a main themed set, you can double up on some of these power levels. And one of the clear indicators here is the problems with Izzet and the cantrips. Sleight of Hand and Opt are both legal in the format, and Opt is in Foundations. So if any other set introduces a 1 mana blue cantrip that helps you filter your draws, you're going to end up with this double up problem again. And if instead they were able to remove Opt from Foundations, if they were updating it once a year, that might give them a better opportunity to keep that stuff more balanced. Ideally, I think they were also trying to make sure that the core set was a good place for new players to begin playing the game. And Universes Beyond has definitely taken over this role. Universes Beyond is probably the most successful new player recruitment tool that Magic has ever had, but anecdotally, I have heard that players who come in through Universes Beyond don't necessarily like other Universes Beyond sets. They might like Magic sets, but the IP that they came in for is really the thing that they liked that sort of connected the dots between Magic and their sort of preferred thing. It's possible, too, that we'll see diminishing returns from these Universes Beyond sets over time being able to do this. We'll see what happens with The Hobbit, and I think that will really give us a clear indication as to whether or not Universes Beyond sets are going to have diminishing returns. Let's get to the fundamental question, and that is Magic in a good position today to survive if the TCG bubble popped right now? A lot of the metrics that Mark Rosewater talks about on his blog come from this focus of more players are now playing the game than ever. We're making more money than ever. These sets were very successful, right? But not a lot of what he's talking about is that the game is in the healthiest state that it's been in. Now, the designers at Wizards of the Coast are some of the best designers in the world, so I'm sure that they are aware of the sort of potential precarious state that the game is in right now. But my biggest concern is that if the signal to noise ratio is off here, where you have a lot of product moving and a lot of sales happening, but it's difficult for you to tell if that's coming from players or from speculators. Magic is probably in a better position than most games here because they have data from sort of their play networks, right? So they can get data directly from game stores about how many people are showing up to events that would indicate that those people are actually buying Magic to play the game. If they're seeing a lot more sales, say from places like Walmart or Amazon or wherever else, these sort of big box stores, they're selling Magic now. If they're seeing a lot of sales there, it might be pretty difficult to tell whether or not those people are players or speculators. And this is a pretty classic problem with TCGs that Magic has kind of had to navigate before, but I will say in the previous TCG bubble in sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, Magic didn't do a lot of the things that were sort of courting speculators the way that they are now. It does really feel like quite a few of the decisions that Wizards are making is to attract a more collector-focused audience. They're kind of leaning into things that like what Pokemon does with lots of special treatments of cards. In terms of the problems that the first Metamorphosis article lays out, it doesn't really feel like they've found a way to solve these problems. It feels more like they've kind of swept them under the rug, right? They don't have to solve them as long as things continue on an upward trajectory. But because the profit incentives were in the standard format, it gave Wizards a reason to design cards at that power level using that sort of Escher stairwell technique that we've talked about, where they can continually put the power in sort of different places to keep everything relatively balanced and not affect the eternal formats too much, right? Sometimes it would happen, but not very often, not nearly as often as it's happening today. It feels like today we're getting possibly multiple cards in each set that come out that have an impact on Legacy. And once that starts happening, that feels like we are pushing the bounds of what Magic's power level can allow. When this TCG bubble inevitably pops, we could see that Magic is left in a position where they scramble to regain the audience that they had before the bubble happened. And we've kind of seen this start happening with D&D in that the old school Renaissance movement kind of pulled a lot of those players that were looking for a particular experience from D&D that they weren't getting anymore. And now D&D is sort of moving back to try to figure out how to regain those players. And many of them have moved on to new games. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also in the description below, you can find links to both of Mark Rosewater's articles. If you are looking to join a community of like-minded game designers who are working on their games or just discuss games in more depth, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description as well. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.